The embargo violates the right to life, the right to health, and the right to education, and the well-being of all Cuban men and women.
Cuba's foreign minister at the United Nations speaking out against U.S. sanctions that have been in place for more than 60 years. Hello, everyone. I'm Asiye Namdar in for Anna Naidu, and you're watching The Heat. The UN General Assembly overwhelmingly passed a resolution on Thursday to condemn the U.S. economic and trade embargo against Cuba, a Cold War measure first imposed in 1960. This year, 187 nations voted in favor of lifting those restrictions, with only 2 countries opposing the move: the United States and Israel, with 1 abstention from Ukraine. CGTN's Luis Chirino starts it off in Havana.
This is the 31st year in a row that the international community has overwhelmingly demanded an end to the U.S. embargo against Cuba. The resolution is not legally binding or enforceable, but it does reflect world opinion. Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez says the more than 60-year blockade violates the rights of all Cuban men and women, depriving families of basic goods, including food and medicine.
From March 1st, 2022 to February 28th, 2023, the damage inflicted by the U.S. blockade translated into more than $4.8 billion. That is $405 million per month, and $1 million every 2 hours, affecting the lives of the Cuban people.
During debates prior to voting on the Cuban draft resolution, representatives of nations and regional blocs like the G77 and the Caribbean community urged the U.S. to lift the embargo.
Producto de la aplicación del bloqueo.
As a consequence of the U.S. blockade, Cuba cannot purchase the appropriate drugs to treat child cancer. Cuban children suffering from cancer should not suffer from this anachronistic and lacerating policy.
Other speakers from Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean denounced the long-standing U.S. policy for violating the Cuban people's human rights, the UN Charter, and international law, and urged the United States to immediately lift its embargo. Bruno Rodriguez said the U.S. restrictions are an act of economic warfare that violates human rights and affect all areas of Cuban society, including education, healthcare, energy, and finances. The vote on the resolution was 187 to end the sanctions, and 2, the United States and Israel, voting to continue, with 1 abstention, Ukraine. Many experts say the U.S. embargo has not achieved its goal, toppling the Cuban socialist government. Instead, it has only brought hardships to the Cuban people. Luis Chirino, CGTN, Havana.
A lot to talk about with our distinguished panel. Joining us from Massachusetts, Peter Kornbluh. He's a senior analyst and director of the Cuba Documentation Project at the National Security Archive. From Havana, we have Rafael Hernandez. He's the editor of Temas, a leading Cuban magazine and author of the History of Havana. In Beijing, Andy Mock is a senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. And finally, Carlos Alzugaray is a political commentator and former Cuban ambassador to the European Union. Carlos, let me begin with you. So another year, another vote at the UNGA, which goes absolutely nowhere. What is the point of the United Nations General Assembly even having this debate when the U.S. keeps voting against the resolution to lift this economic embargo on Cuba that's been in place for more than 60 years?
Well, I think it is important to do it because one of the things that the United States has tried to do in the past is what they call the internationalization of the coercive measures against Cuba. And of course, by presenting this resolution and getting the support of the international community, Cuba makes it very clear that the so-called internationalization of the sanctions against Cuba is not going anywhere. And it's a clear condemnation of United States policies towards Cuba. Of course, the United States has always refused to accept only once they did abstain in the debate, but it demonstrates once more that the United States is hypocritical when they claim that there is an international order that they want to promote, a rules-based order, and they are the first who don't comply with the rules. So it is important for Cuba to get this moral victory, even though it doesn't go any further than that. I was present at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs when we began this exercise in 1992, and we discussed it, and we realized that it wouldn't make the United States move, but it would demonstrate to the world exactly where the United States stood on the issue of complying with rules when it concerns Cuba.
Let me tell you what the U.S. side had to say on Thursday. They said the United States opposes this resolution. We encourage this body to urge the Cuban government to adhere to its human rights obligations and listen to the Cuban people and their aspirations to determine their own future. Peter Kornbluh, what do you think about what the U.S. had to say? And I also want to get you to really talk about the historical perspective. Take us back to why the U.S. imposed this economic embargo, the first time in 1960, I believe, and then again in 1962.
Well, you know, economic rights are human rights as well, and the United States policy is explicitly to violate the economic rights of Cubans, not just Cubans who work for the state and the government in Cuba, but Cubans who are in the private sector in Cuba and have all sorts of constraints and restrictions on being able to expand their businesses because of the embargo. So the kind of counterproductivity of the United States policy, which contributes to human rights violations in Cuba in the economic sense, is there from the embargo. And the truth is that the embargo has gone through a number of phases and purposes. And the initial purpose of the embargo back in 1960, when President Eisenhower imposed the first half of the embargo, cutting off U.S. exports to Cuba, was explicitly to create deprivation and hardship among the Cuban people, because the United States wanted to somehow undermine Fidel Castro's popularity and the popularity of the Cuban Revolution. And this was the idea that they came up with. They would create such deprivation through an economic embargo that the Cuban people would blame Fidel and the revolution for this deprivation rather than the United States of America, which was causing it. Kennedy expanded the embargo policy to a full embargo by cutting off imports from Cuba as well in early 1962, February 3rd, 1962. And the embargo kind of evolved at that point from an effort to deprive Cuba to then an effort to isolate Cuba, starting in 1964 when the Johnson administration basically imposed a multilateral embargo, twisted the arms of the other Latin American countries at the OAS to also impose their own cutoff of commerce, trade, and even diplomatic relations with Cuba. The effort there was to isolate the Cuba as a country and hurt Cuba that way. But I think what's really important to come back to the present and these 31 years of votes at the UN is it's the United States who's diplomatically isolated on the issue of the embargo towards Cuba and not Cuba itself. That's not to say that the embargo at this point isn't very hurtful to the Cuban people, because it is. But in terms of diplomacy and isolation, it's the United States that's isolated rather than Cuba.
Let me go to Rafael Hernandez. I'm just curious, Rafael, what is the overall sentiment among ordinary Cubans? I was in Havana in the 90s, and people are just really busy with their daily lives, with their daily economic hardships. I found the Cubans to be very entrepreneurial. We had dinners and lunches in people's homes where they had turned part of their house into a business. Is this something that is on their radar, the economic embargo, and what do they think about their relationship with the U.S.?
Well, if there's something about which most Cubans are agreeing, they agree, is about the counterproductive and terrible effect of U.S.-Cuban policy in general, not only the embargo. The embargo is not voted by the majority of Cubans. It is not voted even by the majority of Cubans who live in the United States. It is not responding to any democratic idea. It is imposing what was adopted, first of all, as a warfare tool, because the embargo in 1960, and particularly in 1962, was part of an annihilation plan that was aimed to facilitate the American military intervention in Cuba at some point. The idea was that the embargo was part of a military operation, and the military operation included isolation, economic isolation, political isolation, and that was preparing, that was part of a military intervention plan. So that is the origin of the embargo. This is why Cubans call it blockade, el bloqueo in Spanish. Basically, embargo is supposed to be an instrument to push a certain government, a certain state, certain country in a particular direction. The blockade is a military device. It's a military idea. It is part of the military handbooks about intervention. And the embargo is not just a bilateral restriction about trade, financial operations, etc., that makes the United States a market that is not available for Cuba and others, and vice versa. The embargo, the Cuban blockade is not an embargo because it is multilateral, because it is having a global effect. It is damaging, it is interfering not just in U.S.-Cuban trade or economic relations. It is interfering in all Cuban relations, trade relations, economic relations with the rest of the world. Because firms around the world, Japanese firms, Chinese firms, the Argentinian firms that want to have a certain relationship, a trade relationship with Cuba, have to take into account the restrictions, the sanctions, and the threats that are part of the embargo. So, as a matter of fact, the embargo is not just creating a situation of difficulty and making it very, very hard to get anything from the United States, including medications, including not only food, but drugs that are needed in Cuban hospitals.
You make a good point. And you brought up China into the equation, and let me turn to Andy Mock. Andy, the world has changed a lot in the 61 years since these restrictions were imposed on Cuba. China is now the second largest economy in the world. So how would you describe China's approach when it comes to this island nation?
Absolutely. Well, China has always respected and followed this idea of respect for sovereignty and non-interference in another country's affairs, in particular, respecting the development choices that a country makes. And this makes me think of a saying that the devil's greatest achievement was convincing the world that he doesn't exist. And we see the U.S. portraying itself as a defender and advocate for human rights. But in reality, as we see with Cuba, with this embargo or this blockade, that it really is an egregious violation of human rights, because economic rights, the ability to have access to food, medicine, and fuel, really is a basic human right. And we see the U.S. engaging in these egregious human rights abuses, as well as others around the world, attacking countries militarily, taking other ways to undermine governments around the world, and being complicit in really atrocious human rights abuses and even genocide. So it's really, again, I think, the Chinese view is that respect for other countries is vital, and despite the U.S.'s rhetoric, in some instances at least, it is not living up to that.
And China, we should add, has repeatedly spoken out against unilateral sanctions on a number of situations in Iran as well as Cuba. Carlos Alzugaray, by the way, I love saying your name. Cuban officials had been in the U.S. to negotiate the lifting of this economic embargo. Clearly, that did not go so well, did it?
Well, it went as expected. The American position in this Cold War, as in all the United States Cold Wars, is basically to demand the unconditional surrender of the other side. They want Cuba to change its economic and political system.
But the Cubans came
but
Carlos, the Cubans did come to the United States to try to make some headway. So why would they make that trip if they believe it was going to be completely unsuccessful?
Well, because there are other issues involving the Cuban-U.S. relations. There are security issues, there are immigration issues, there are climate issues. So the position of Cuba has been very realistic. There's no reason why we cannot advance on other issues because of the embargo or because of the coercive
So
measure.
what other issues?
So there are issues.
So what other issues do you think they managed to bridge the differences, if you will?
Well, the U.S., except during the Obama administration, because the Obama administration really took a realistic position towards Cuba, except that it couldn't lift the sanctions because they are a law of Congress. But the Cuban government says, well, let's go and negotiate, for example, migration. We have migration agreements since 1994, 1995. And the interesting thing is that Cuba has always said, listen, there is always going to be immigration from Cuba to the United States. What we have to do is ensure that this immigration takes place legally, orderly, and without prejudice or danger for the people who emigrate. Now, for many years, the policy of the United States was to stimulate illegal immigration until finally at one point things got so bad that they had to accept what the Cuban government had been proposing all the time. Let's have an immigration agreement, let's have an immigration quota, let's stop promoting illegal immigration. By the way, all these worked very well for between 1994 and 2017, and suddenly with Trump, things changed because Trump closed down the consulate in Havana, closed all the ways of emigration legally from Cuba to the United States, and then we had a new immigration crisis. We had had no immigration crisis between Cuba and the United States since 1995 till 2019. And now we have a new one because the United States abandoned the treaties.
So
now,
you're saying
Cuba
there's a direct,
interested...
Carlos, so you're saying there's a direct correlation with this economic embargo on Cuba and the flow of Cubans leaving the island and trying to come to the United States?
It is true. Listen, the relation between Cuba and the United States is very similar to the relation of any small, underdeveloped country that has a close neighbor that is developed. Look at Europe. Look at Central America and the United States. So there is going to be immigration even in the best circumstances for Cuba. Now, the thing is this. Do you want immigration to be done in a legal way, in an orderly way, without danger for people? Or do you want to use immigration as a weapon to undermine the Cuban government and to destabilize the Cuban government? And that's what the United States did for I don't know how many years. What happened? They ended with 3 immigration crises, 1965, 1980, and 1995. And now there is another immigration crisis. But when you have an agreement, when you have conversation, when you have diplomats talking to each other, you might handle with all these problems. And this is the position of the Cuban government.
Peter, do you agree with what Carlos had to say about immigration and the direct link and the weaponization of it for the U.S. administration?
The U.S. embargo, particularly the sanctions that were escalated by Donald Trump in 2018, 2019, these have been very severe. Cuba has been hit economically with a double whammy. The pandemic with COVID, which shut down Cuba's borders and the borders of so many countries and ended for almost 2 years any type of tourism income, and the sanctions from Donald Trump. And so the Cuban economy is in a very dire strait. There isn't enough money to actually buy goods. You can't, even in the United States, because Cuba is allowed to buy food from the United States under the embargo rules at this time with cash. Very difficult to get fuel on the international market. The U.S. embargo is counterproductive to U.S. interests. That's the stupidity of it all, the malevolence and stupidity of it all. We don't want to see hundreds of thousands of Cubans fleeing the island and coming to the United States. If Cuba had a better economic situation, if there was no U.S. embargo, if the United States had economic policies that helped the expansion of the private sector in Cuba, less Cubans would be leaving the island and more Cubans would be staying. So it's against U.S. interest to continue this extremely counterproductive and malevolent policy at this point. But
Peter, go ahead quickly, please.
Well, the embargo is a symbol of the perpetual hostility of U.S. policy towards the Cuban Revolution. It's kind of stuck in that position politically. And now that we're entering a presidential campaign year next year, it's very unlikely that the embargo is going to be changed.
I have to ask all of you, and this is a question for all 4 of you, the Cuban American vote in Florida. Would you all agree it plays a critical factor in shaping U.S. policy towards Cuba? Rafael, yes or no?
No, I don't think that
you don't
Cuban
think?
American vote is. I don't think that the Cuban American vote is anything but essential to win Florida. This is a myth. This is not true. It has never been true. It is a justification. It has been a justification, the Florida vote, or the role of the Cuban Americans in that Florida vote to justify the continuation, the continuity of the U.S. policy towards Cuba. When the United States wanted at some point to change the policy, like in the Obama years, they did it, despite that Cuban American right-wing opposition. Because, as a matter of fact, most Cubans who live in the United States would have the lifting of the embargo and the normalization of relations as a benefit, as a blessing.
Andy, I want to ask you a lot more questions to all of you, but we're going to move on. I mean, when I talk to Cuban Americans, especially the ones in Miami, they are very, very hardcore in their position, and they adamantly refuse to have any kind of opening on anything that lifts the economic sanctions or the embargo on Cuba. But let me move on, Andy. Cuba, of course, is part of the Belt and Road Initiative. How much do you think China can help Cuba's economic development and the future? Where do you see the relationship going down the road?
Well, I think with the Belt and Road Initiative, the backbone of this is infrastructure, whether we're looking at electricity generation, ports, highways, etc. And my understanding of Cuba is that this would be enormously valuable. So I think this is one way, certainly, that Cuba and China can work together. Of course, China is an enormous market for everything from agricultural commodities to finished goods. And I think this is, again, many countries around the world see this as an opportunity as well. And I think at the United Nations, I think many wish that the United Nations was vested with more authority to address some of these injustices that we see around the world. But it's certainly not voiceless, and I think the UN plays a crucial role as the conscience of the world. And China, I think, has been an important part of that.
I'd like to finish up by going around our panel. Each of you, 10, 15 seconds, please. Not much longer than that because we're running out of time. Final thought. Carlos, let me begin with you.
No, I would like to go back to the myth of the Cuban American vote. You know who were the three Democratic candidates for president who obtained more Cuban American votes? Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012, and Hillary Clinton in 2016. So there you have it. It's a myth that Cuban Americans want a hard line on Cuba.
That's very interesting to me. Peter, do you agree with that? Quickly, please.
Well, Florida has been a swing state in in elections, but perhaps it's not necessary for the Democrats to win to have Florida. So it doesn't have to be a swing state, and in that sense, the Cuban American vote doesn't have to be really relevant to the embargo. What's relevant to the embargo is U.S. interests, and U.S. interests are to have normal relations with Cuba for migration, for counterterrorism operations, for counter-narcotics operations, and simply for humanitarian reasons, to help the private sector and let Cubans live their own life and bring about their own change, irregardless of U.S. pressures. So the perpetual hostility has to end in U.S. policy at some point.
Gentlemen, a fascinating discussion. Thank you all for being here. Carlos Alzugaray, Peter Kornbluh, Rafael Hernandez, and Andy Mock. Many, many thanks. And we need to leave it there. I'm Asya Inamdar in Washington. Thanks for watching another edition of the